Voluntary assisted dying is a complex and tricky and deeply personal issue. Some of those who support it are practicing Christians who work in healthcare. Interestingly, some of those most opposed to it are practicing Christians who work in healthcare. Queensland's Law Reform Commission has been charged with recommending a legal framework for voluntary assisted dying in Queensland, but it's already law in Victoria, soon to start in Western Australia and being considered in several other states. So what's driving laws allowing euthanasia? Does the personal nature of dying make this an individual right? Or should the preservation of life be at the heart of these public discussions? Should politicians who hand the decision-making to health professionals during a pandemic do the same when it comes to an issue like euthanasia? And what does this mean for those who might seek it and the health professionals who are asked where it is legal to be involved in delivering it? The care first approach to end-of-life care is the topic of our discussion, and that also points clearly to the important role here of palliative care. My name is Madonna King, and a terrific panel with us to discuss this. Let me introduce them. The Archbishop Mark Coleridge from the Archdiocese of Brisbane. Archbishop Mark Coleridge from the Archdiocese of Brisbane. Welcome, Your Grace. Chair of St Vincent's Health Reconciliation Action Plan, Darlene Dries. We have Dr. Philip Good, palliative medicine specialist at St Vincent's Private Hospital in Brisbane. Dr. Judith McInerney, a retired palliative medicine specialist. Disability rights advocate Samantha Connor joins us from Western Australia. Thanks, Samantha. Father Frank Brennan, rector at Newman College at the University of Melbourne, is a lawyer, ethicist and former head of Catholic Social Services Australia. Always good to chat to you, Father. And Professor Jane Turner, a psychiatrist with a heart of gold, whose focus is people with cancer. Can I welcome you all? And let me start by focusing on the end of life, which most of us don't understand well. And I want to go to our medicos first here. So Jane, just tell me about the people you see.
All of the patients I see have cancer, and probably half, 2/3 of those have advanced disease. And I think having a life-limiting illness really raises complex existential issues. And the reason I think I have a role in seeing those people is because we live in a community where we're really agnostic about death, dying, strong emotions. Families often inhibit discussion about those things. And actually, when people ask me why I see people who are dying, I say, because it inspires me, the way people handle this, what they bring to this, and it makes me optimistic that I might have the good grace to face my end with the same grace that I see in my patients.
A lovely answer. Can I go to you, Philip? Have you got a patient you can tell us about that you've learnt from? Provide a picture for
us. Thanks very much, Madonna. Similar to Jane in terms of how I see looking after people at the end of life, I think it's a real privilege. I think about just last week, I was visiting 2 different people at home, and what was really wonderful was a lady who lived in a house for a long time, a lot of her life, and she wanted to remain in her house at home at the end. And by her being in her house at the end and her children being able to come in and look after her in conjunction with palliative care service and other people, it really enabled them as a family to give her what she really desired, which was a peaceful death at home. And also, despite the challenges and the difficulties and the emotions that come up from around that time, as a family, they were really able to come together and just embrace this person's life, look after her at the end, and really, I thought, gave her a wonderful, dignified death. And what I learned, similar to what Jane was saying from that, is the challenge that we all face in our own lives when we look at our own dying period, and will we be as courageous as people I see? Will we be able to help our loved ones as I see people do, to care for them? And a lot of it is a response in terms of just giving back as a society to others, and just giving back to other people, and people that have been looking after ourselves when we were children. Now, as a child, you get to look after parents or other loved ones, and you get to help them out. So I guess similar to what Jane was saying, I learn every day from patients. They get to give me a gift of stories and a gift of their life that I can learn from every day.
Judith, just going on what Philip said, there's certainly pressure people are under at this time. Just talk to me about the kind of pressure people are under.
First of all, I echo so much of what Jane and Philip have each said. End of life brings all sorts of pressures. There are the aspects of closure of life that come, and they each have a pressure. So people have a need to seek sometimes forgiveness for something that they've done. They need to say that they're sorry for something. They want to say thank you. And there's sometimes pressure in that families have inevitably become estranged. And I think we've all come across myriads of families where people, for one reason or another, sometimes relatively trivial reasons, have become estranged from people they love.
Okay.
And the end of life brings a wish to reconcile that. And I think that can sometimes be with great pressure.
So can I go back to you, Philip, on the basis of that? What kind of decisions are they needing to make at this time?
Look, I think echoing what Judith said, that the caring is a really tough thing for people to do. And I guess part of the decision-making carers need to decide about is, can they manage each day? And I think one of the things that we always tell people about, like, caring is more than one person job. It's really hard for someone as a carer to just on their own look after someone at the end of life. And so again, that's where it comes down to this idea that caring for someone at the end of life, especially at home, is a societal thing. It's not an individual thing. It's really as a community, for communities to come together.
Okay, I will come back to that a little bit later when we look at individual rights, I think. But can I go to your Grace here? Do you see a real difference near the end of life with those who have faith, from your experience?
Well, I think faith opens a whole horizon of hope that transforms the experience of both life and death. And in some ways, euthanasia or VAD represents a perhaps unexpressed hopelessness, whereas faith at its best, no, I don't mean faith as an ideology, but I mean opening on to the great mystery of an infinite love, which enables someone like St. Francis of Assisi to speak about sister death, death not to be feared, but even strangely to be embraced. So whilst I don't doubt for a moment that there are people without faith who live good lives and die good deaths, I've certainly seen in my own now long life as a minister to the living and the dead that faith can make all the difference. It transfigures the horror into something that can almost be a gift. And I think of my own father's death. It seemed to take forever. We thought he'd never die. But when he did eventually die, I think the family recognised that one of the best things he ever did for us was die, and die the way he did. So I think one of the cultural factors that converge in this cultural tide that leads to these legislative pushes is in fact this denial of death, which conceals a fear of death and a desperate desire to control that which in the end we cannot control.
Okay,
So,
I want to talk about that in a moment, go on to that in a moment, but I'm just kind of interested in that period at the end of the life. What do you mean when you say when your dad died the way he did?
Well, I think he evoked something in each of us in the family and in all of us as family, that the experience of remaining with him as Mary and John remain at the foot of the cross, or as the Good Samaritan remains with the seeming corpse he finds in the ditch by the roadside, that experience of accompanying someone to death, whether it be family or as a priest, is a most profound experience. And I don't doubt that the medical people in this group know exactly what I'm talking about. It is a profound experience that enriches your own living and, I imagine, when the time comes, our own dying. It is an extraordinary experience. And again, VAD says, I can no longer remain with you. For all that it's difficult, and God knows it is, but that I can no longer remain with you. You are on your own. And there's something stunted about that from a human point of view. And
Okay.
why speak of VAD, for instance, as humane or human, I think is an unmooring of language.
Okay, I'll come back to that and maybe even challenge you a little bit on that a bit later. But can I go to Father Frank Brennan? You're in Melbourne. In other jurisdictions, you don't need to receive counselling to access voluntary assisted dying. Just ignore VAD for a moment. Talk to me how you see, as a priest, the role of counselling when someone's condition is terminal. What should or what does it deliver?
Oh, I don't know that I'm the expert on that, but my experience, just being a part-time hospital chaplain, is that more often than not, counselling is about being an attentive listener and allowing people to evince and evoke what they're wanting to put and say. But also, I often find around the deathbed, I mean, sure, front and centre is the person in the bed, but also there are the loved ones. And these things, I think it's a joint decision. And I think all of us could attest, and the medicos know it better than I, but I mean, those who have the best deaths are those who feel that it's all done and they've got permission to go. I mean, I had a beautiful experience the other day. I've been doing the anointings here at St. Vincent's and, doing up in the whole PPE and all the rest of it, and no visitors were allowed. I had one gentleman who came from country Victoria, and there he was dying, and he was a big burly guy, and he'd obviously fought very hard. And we had the iPad there. The nurse was wonderful in her full PPE. And the wife just spoke to him and said, now, darling, you've done it all. You can let go now. You can go. Well, there's no place for father there, except I'm there to do the sacramental bit with the anointing. But I mean, there's counselling at its best. And it came out of relationship, the loved ones, where there's a joint decision. It's time to let go. So I think that's counselling at its best.
In all of your responses so far, the word dignity kind of comes to mind a little bit. And can I go to Darlene here about the role that dignity plays? I mean, is there dignity in people choosing their death, someone owning that decision, or do you see that as secondary to a responsibility to receive care, perhaps?
Thank you, Madonna. The deaths that I've been involved with, either as a family member or in my professional role, unfortunately, too many of them have concerned younger people. And I certainly know, speaking from the wisdom of the elders, that is never good. What is it in our society that enables that? And we don't necessarily see a way out from that. There is a dignity. I look at the example of our elders, and through this conversation, there's been a thread of an aging aspect.
Yeah.
I have many conversations with my peers, and I will tell you now, from late 30s to mid 50s, this is a conversation that's on our minds: death, dying, our demise, because we know that it's in all likelihood going to happen earlier for us than the general Australian population. So we look at this through quite fresh and invigorated eyes, and we can talk openly about that. And I think there is dignity in that approach. We have this research, we have the numbers, we've seen what's happened to fathers and grandfathers. That gift of time may not be there, and so we embrace that knowledge.
offline, you talked to me about the seasonality of life that was more understood in traditional times. Educate us here.
Yes, I've seen it in many of the papers written about this topic, voluntary assisted dying. And there is a time for everything. Since we were little, you know, growing up in community, this was not removed. This was seen every day, often many generations living together, as was the case with my family. So you would see and you would appreciate people aging, and you would also see people suffering at different stages of life. And that call to accompaniment, so strong, from people who may not have been educated or clinical leads or doing all they could, and regarding that as an honour, a terrific honour. You know, the least educated people to be at the bedside, just holding strong and relieving each other in turn. It was a community effort.
Thank you for that answer, Darlene. And can I go to you, Judith, on the back of that? Because everyone's painted dying as a very special time. And I don't think the community necessarily sees it that way. Is that the nub of the problem, how we actually see death?
I guess it comes up to, for many people, they don't see death. And our whole community is so unfamiliar these days with what is normal dying. What happens as people get older, get frailer, accumulate multiple diagnoses, and something happens that brings them to the close of their life. And many people have never been involved with someone who has died. Now, my own experience was that I knew my two of my grandparents as they died. And I was deeply involved with my father as he died relatively young. But many people, I know that Philip and Jane will echo this too, come to the deathbed, as we've referred to, and they actually don't know what to expect. And it's like a record player explaining people, which is great. I mean, I love doing that, telling people what to expect and allaying many of the fears, because that's the thing, it's fear of the unknown, and we don't know.
Samantha, what are you thinking when you hear that? When you hear all of this, what's going on in your head?
It's quite different from the perspective of the disability community because, you know, we're 20% of the community and we're a really diverse community. So we have that diversity of opinion just the same as everybody else does. But when people are talking about dignity, you know, we're a community of people. I'm a wheelchair user and have muscular dystrophy. We're a community of people who live with support in ways that people would normally regard as being a burden or you know, without dignity, but we do live with dignity. So it's quite a nuanced kind of conversation for us. As somebody who, you know, my perspective is a secular and rights-based perspective that, you know, if we don't get support as disabled people, you know, to live a good life, then how can we be given the right to, you know, make a choice that isn't there? You know, so we shouldn't be able to have a choice between, you know, not being able to get out of bed on the weekends or not have somebody to do our personal care or die, you know, or not have any friends, you know, they're the sorts of issues. So they're quite tricky issues to unpack and they're quite hard for non-disabled people to sometimes understand.
Absolutely. And I want to come back to you when we talk about the risks of euthanasia type legislation. And let me move on from that end of life discussion, perhaps to the increasing acceptance, certainly in the community, for euthanasia type laws. Your Grace, surveys have shown people support these laws in your own backyard, up to something like 80% of people. Tell me what you think is driving that support.
Well, first of all, Madonna, I don't trust those polls that are regularly trotted out. The figure given here in Queensland of 82%, I simply don't trust for many reasons. So let's just set those aside, because there is no question that whatever about polls, that there is a cultural tide. And it's the result, I think, of a convergence of a number of powerful factors that have deep historical roots. Now, one of them, I think, is a kind of an individualism that sets nothing above individual autonomy and freedom. Now, of course, everyone is in favour of individual autonomy and freedom, which is one of the great triumphs of the West. But when it becomes an absolute, it runs the risk of becoming a kind of an ideology that can turn deeply destructive. And it can turn the morally acceptable into that which I choose. Now, if we come to that point, we are building on sand. The moral house is built on sand. So that's one cultural factor. Another is a secularization that takes its leave of God. And again, this is a long historical process. So the sense that I will decide, any sense of the divine will in either life or death is set aside. The whole understanding of death, and that implies an understanding of life, that death is something to fear, something to be denied, therefore, and which one must, as best one can, attempt to control. So there's the whole way in which our cultures address both life and death, because the push for euthanasia, for instance, embodies a seriously diminished understanding of both life and death. In that sense, the death of hope is a sense of possibility. And then also, I think governments, as their competence in many ways is either diminished or abolished. I mean, governments are becoming less powerful in real terms. They tend to expend energy in areas like euthanasia, areas which might go under the rubric of social engineering, because it gives them a certain competence which is now denied to them, often in areas like the economy. So I think those sorts of factors, and there would be others, converge to create a cultural tide that people like me have to try and, certainly to take seriously, but also try and understand, not just to stand back and deliver thunderbolts of condemnation, but to try and understand what is going on in the culture, because it's like, it's the air people breathe, it's in me and you. So that's our first task, is to understand it and then to engage it in a way that is creative and respectful, speaking as we can, but also identifying the falsehoods that are often contained in some fairly slippery language, because language is part of this.
So obviously that individual right versus a societal view is at the heart of what you're saying and what a lot of other people are saying. But can you understand, from someone who doesn't know if they support euthanasia laws or not, can something like euthanasia be a deeply personal decision by one person, or why can't it be?
Well, it is a deeply personal decision, of course. No one denies that. But to say that it's only a deeply personal decision is to have a hopelessly one-dimensional view of the human person, for one thing. So it's intensely personal, but it's also intensely communal. And that's why people like me speak what often sounds like a foreign language, the language of the common good. You see, an individual's decision to favour suicide and the decision of others to cooperate in that amounts to a kind of poisoning of the wells in the entire society. It's not just about the individual or those who collaborate in the event of killing or dying. It does affect the entire society. And my concern is driven by that. I'm all in favour of individual autonomy and freedom, but not when it's set over and against the common good, as I think it is in this case. So intensely...
Do you equate voluntary assistance dying with suicide?
Yes, I do. More needs to be said, but at its essence, yes, I do.
Yeah.
There is a decision that death is preferable to life, and there is a decision to kill, to terminate the life intentionally of another human being. I don't know what else you call it.
Yeah, okay. So Philip, can I go to you on the back of those comments from Your Grace? As a doctor, do you think people decide on this issue for social reasons or specifically for health reasons?
Yeah, well, certainly my view around this is that palliative care is a health issue, and voluntary assisted dying is a societal or social issue. And I think people seem to sort of confuse the two and try and make out that somehow voluntary assisted dying is a health issue. You know, people come to palliative care because they want to live. They want to live as well as possible, usually as long as possible. They want to live as best as possible. They come because they're having different symptom control issues, physical symptoms, psychological issues, social issues, and they want to, or spiritual issues, and they want to try and improve those in some way to make their life as best as possible.
So you're saying it's almost the antithesis of voluntary assisted dying.
Well, people choose voluntary assisted dying not for health issues in reality. So people, there's this perception that people, I mean, one of the biggest pushes for voluntary assisted dying is, oh, we need it there because not everyone's pain can be controlled. But when you look at why people access voluntary assisted dying and other forms, physician assisted dying, pain is never really an issue at all in that sense. It's really about what I consider societal issues, things like loss of dignity, loss of autonomy, fear of the future, loss of independence. So there's a lot of things that which I think you know, that you worry about it if it's from a point of view of a societal issue and trying to solve probably what are societal issues by a health outcome. And I'm not sure that's always the best way to do things.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And Samantha, I can see you nodding your head. What do you want to say?
Oh, just vehement agreement. You know, that I live in a community of people who experience chronic pain, and it's, you know, pain is, you can have really bad days as a disabled person who experiences pain. You know, I have really bad days, but it actually isn't the reason that people, you know, predominantly want to use VAD. It's actually that fear of burden. It's not living a good life. It's all of those other things. And it's a really, really difficult thing to talk about because people just have this idea. And so my other perspective, I guess, is that my mother came from a background of Ashkenazi Jews and has had a gene called the BRCA gene. And so all of the women in my family, except for me, because I got muscular dystrophy instead of a gene that gives you breast and ovarian cancer, died of cancer. And so when she first got cancer, she had ovarian cancer, cervical cancer, and breast cancer, and multiple operations over many years, bone cancer, etc. And I remember going to the hospital with her for a first diagnosis, and she was told that, you know, her options medically, and her first memory as a family member was of her mother being upstairs in, you know, the 1950s screaming, and while she went to school and came home and looked after mum. So it really was about that fear. Mum had a really good death, you know, as a family member. So I remember, you know, explaining to her at her end of life that she was going into palliative care because they couldn't fix her anymore. And she said, oh, good. You know, it doesn't mean I'm dying. And she said, oh, good. So she actually, she had a good experience because she had good doctors, good medical care. And the thing that made her say, oh, good, I think, was that she had not great disability support. So she was only allowed to travel within a certain amount of kilometres. She only had 15 hours of aged care in the community per week. So it's a really tricky thing when, you know, when people just think you're in intolerable pain. And, you know, when you look at the studies of why people say that they want to access it, it never is that at the end.
All right, so I'll take that up again when we talk about the concerns or risks each of you have. But can I go to Father Frank Brennan and just pause this for a moment in terms of these laws are now in operation in Victoria. And when we talked offline, I just want you to spend a minute or two telling us what you think, how they've unfolded or the impact so far of those laws.
I haven't heard a lot personally. I mean, I help out at St Vincent's Hospital, and I mean, Catholic outfits like St Vincent's and Mercy have made clear that they won't be participating in this sort of regime. So it's not something that impacts greatly in those facilities at this stage. In terms of the community generally, I haven't heard a lot anecdotally. I did see one report that indicated that the numbers of cases were quite considerably higher than what was originally predicted in the institution of the regime. And of course, there's already a push on to get rid of some of the safeguards that were put in. And, you know, I'm sure that'll happen in Queensland too. It'll be in terms of what we want is, all right, now that we've instituted this regime, then some of the safeguards that are put in order to appease those opposed to the changes can then be whittled back. So I think that's where the debate is now starting in Victoria.
What kind of safeguards are being eroded?
Well, at this stage, not being eroded, but the question is, I mean, how many days notice you have to give, how many times you have to give notice, what length of time there would be required, what witnesses, things of that sort.
And what has been the impact with the Catholic organisations not being involved, either for those organisations or for people seeking voluntary assisted dying?
I think for the hospitals, it hasn't been a problem. I imagine down the track, there will be an issue for some of the aged care facilities, you know, the so-called retirement villages or whatever, in that very definitely these Catholic facilities, they want to ensure that they make a home for the people who are there. Yeah. So what's going to happen in the situation of someone who's in one of these homes, might have been living there for a year or two, it's their home, but then decide that they want to avail themselves of voluntary assisted dying? Well, the initial stages of filling in the forms and that sort of thing, will that be permitted within the village? Is that said to be being complicit in that sort of activity? There'll be some of the sorts of questions that have to be addressed.
Following up on those questions raised by Father Frank Brennan, can I just go to the concerns each of you have in relation to these laws? And I'll start with you, Your Grace. What actually keeps you awake at night over this? What's your biggest concern?
Well, that in fact it amounts to a serious erosion of what I judge to be a genuinely human society. Again, I'm concerned for individuals. At heart, I'm a pastor, whatever else I'm called. But as a human being, I think that this kind of legislation with its slippery language, where you have words like dignity and compassion and freedom used a great deal, but not always in a transparent way, and sometimes they conceal something quite different. I can't see I'm all for human dignity and compassion and freedom. Surely we all are, but I can't for the life of me see how the legislation that is proposed in Queensland, which is likely to be even more liberal than the legislation passed in Western Australia, which in turn was more liberal than the legislation in Victoria. There seems to be a pattern of the kind that Frank Brennan was referring to. We haven't yet seen the legislation in draft here, though it's coming more quickly than we expected. We've only just discovered. So that's the thing that most troubles me, that in claiming to create a society in which dignity and compassion and freedom are protected and enshrined and advanced, I think we might in fact be doing the opposite. So that with the best of intention, and there are many examples of this in history, we end up doing the exact opposite of the very thing we had in mind.
Jane?
So that's my overarching concern. There are many others that flow from it.
Jane, what's your overarching concern? Do you have?
My overarching concern is that this isn't a binary process. You know, it's not like you're facing a terminal illness, are you okay, or are you not okay, therefore we'll have VAD. And we've heard about palliative care, but we haven't acknowledged high rates of depression, existential distress in people at end of life. Now, the data in Victoria is terrifying. 136 people sought VAD. 3 were deemed ineligible, and ineligibility relates to the forecast prognosis, but also apparently excludes people with serious mental illness like depression. Yeah. And up to 50% of people with terminal illness have depression. So it's extraordinary that those people weren't seen as depressed or excluded. The data from Canada is equally concerning. And we talk about language. It's called MAID, Medical Assistance in Dying. It somehow sounds rather cosy and nice. Now, they have a 10-day cooling off period between requesting that and enacting, and that's dispensed, not infrequently, for no obvious reason. In Canada, there has been legislation now to allow organ donation after assisted dying, and some people have actually advocated that organs could be removed before death is enacted in order to keep them in pristine condition. I guess my biggest concern is the slippery slope, and people negate that. But in Belgium, people can be euthanized because of mental illness. In Australia, we have a terrible, terrible history of decimating First Nations people. And I worry terribly that if we can administer VAD, we will negate help seeking and healthcare seeking from our Indigenous population.
All right, so can I go there straight to Darlene on that? Do you worry about the impact of this on First Nations people?
Absolutely, and thank you, Jane. It's good to segue off that. I've just written here, my mind boggles with the amount of energy and resources necessarily turned towards this discussion on VAD and all the discussions. When we have two groups of, the First Nations people of this land who have yet to live fully, and in their own words, I think they would say to flourish fully in their own land. So I hear what you said, Jane, and I concur.
Okay, so Samantha, on this, and Jane mentioned mental disability overseas. In most jurisdictions, certainly in Australia, disability or mental illness is not an eligibility criteria. Why isn't that enough protection?
Well, I would arguably be eligible, so all disabilities come from a medical condition. So, I have a condition called limb-girdle muscular dystrophy type 2I, which I'm horrified to hear about the numbers of access in Victoria, because, what does that look like in Victoria for disabled people and older people who are having their lives devalued every single day, with people arguing for freedoms around COVID, in a pandemic, where it's okay because it's just going to be the old people and the disabled people who are dying. And so it's a really personal issue for us. There's no way you can separate these issues because they're very tricky, nuanced kind of issues. There's issues with huge rates of depression from any community of people, including disability communities, First Nation communities, communities of people with diverse sexualities. There's really, people face oppression, and that informs their mental health. And I'm in Western Australia, so this is a very personal issue for me as well.
Absolutely would be. And you say, so in the eligibility criteria, disability or mental illness does not prompt eligibility for it. But what you're saying is people can use the disease or the problem behind that disability or mental illness to make themselves eligible.
And there's a young person who's, I don't think yet 30, who's actually has my same diagnosis, which is a rare disease, who's lobbying for the pro-assisted dying community, who's saying, I'm dying of this condition. So for me, when I was first diagnosed, I'm old, I'm 52. So I didn't have a firm diagnosis as a younger person. And it is a terrifying thing when you have all these, perspectives around disability. But now I have 6 children, I have 2 grandchildren. I'm a youth leader. I've had a productive life, working and living a fun life, So I kind of, I have meaning in my life, and I just think, this is just a complicated issue, and it's really, really hard to have that complicated discussion around where the lines of disability start and where, palliative care is involved, and things like motor neurone disease are really hard for us to come to terms with, I think.
Thank you. And you certainly don't look old enough to have grandchildren from this end. Judith, we're talking about the elderly, the disabled. Where does the throwaway culture fit in here? Is that a concern of yours?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been, I'm in WA where everything is open because we locked down hard early. But I remember early on there was a film that came out called Me Before You, which was about this romantic story where a quadriplegic decided to end his life at Dignitas. And Not Dead Yet and the disability community across the world protested around this film. And I remember we had a giant tin that we were, using as a prop. And I thought I was funny because we were going to the pub afterwards, and I shook it at a lady and said, "I'm going to kill myself because, because of this movie, la, la, la. Would you like to donate to help in my death?" And this woman put money in it. And so we did a social experiment and nobody said no, for an hour. And I was horrified that, just because I was sitting down and I'm a wheelchair user, that nobody said, "Are you okay?" What would you say to someone who was standing on the edge of a bridge and saying they wanted to end their life? Normally you'd put your hand out and you go, "Can I help you? Are you okay?" Do anything that you could. And people were willing to actually facilitate my death because of their perception of disability. So yeah, it's I think the throwaway culture issue is a very, very real one. And ableism and that perception of what being disabled means is a really important one.
Judith?
Yeah, I haven't really thought of a lot in terms of the throwaway culture. I guess for a lot of people who support our access to assisted dying or assisted suicide, don't actually think about themselves being unwell. They're thinking in terms of, I'm well and I wouldn't like to be like that. And in their younger state, they can't actually say that. I think there's a huge, one of the things that I really worry about is, we've alluded to ignorance about the normal death process, but I think there's an awful lot of ignorance about what assisted dying involves and what it is. And that people think it's the equivalent of, say, turning off a respirator, or not having treatment, or not being able to use pain relief generously when someone is distressed. And that leads people to say, I want access to being knocked off because I don't want to go through that sort of distress. And they don't realise that there's already laws that enable, that allow doctors and others in the palliative care team to address that sort of distress.
So does making it law give it the imprimatur to do it, that it's okay?
Well, it does, yeah. I mean, people can access it without even being aware of what it is.
And are they accessing it because they think they can't see another way out?
They don't know that there's another way of approaching. Don't know about what palliative care can offer and what it can truly do in a team-like environment, accessing, as Philip referred to before, help in a whole lot of different ways for the different sorts of distress that come to people as they approach end of life.
What are you thinking, Philip?
Just in answer to the first question you asked about what does keep you awake at night and what your concerns are, I think my concerns are echoed by a lot of palliative care clinicians in Queensland, is that we all think there should be really excellent access to palliative care first. That should be the first thing that the government should be investing in. The government should have aims and goals to invest in palliative care to make it as good as possible for everyone in the state. And then when everyone in the state has state-of-the-art quality palliative care, that is a time perhaps to have a discussion about where does VAD fit. Like to have this discussion before that's in place seems very premature. I'll give you an example. So in Queensland, for example, access to palliative care really depends a lot on where you live. And you can't say everyone's got the same access whether they live in the city. People in different parts of Brisbane have different access to palliative care, let alone if you live in rural and regional and remote. And I remember clearly when the VAD legislation was coming into Victoria, and I was on a panel and a talk, and someone who was involved in the working committee to bring it in said that one of their goals was to enable everyone in Victoria, no matter where they live, to have equal access to VAD. And I said, that's really amazing that you would do that, because even in Victoria at the moment, not everyone in Victoria has equal access to palliative care. And so I guess as we're seeing like this thing about, palliative care Queensland, AMAQ and medical directors of Group of Queensland have put out that they really think that Queensland needs an extra $275 million a year to fully fund to really state-of-the-art palliative care. And one of the major parties has put out they'll fund an extra $25 million per year coming up. So the difference is that we see it as 99% of people will, 100% of people will want palliative care, and 1% of people will want VAD, perhaps, if that. Like, it's really about trying to improve palliative care and try and improve and put money into that first to make it access for everyone.
I will come back to that, but just before I go to you, Your Grace, if palliative care was fixed to this quality and this access, would your view on voluntary assisted dying be different?
Well, I think my concern about that is, again, what my concern is that I would not want, as Judith said, someone to think about accessing voluntary assisted dying because they think they're getting inadequate palliative care. Okay. That's my view on that, is that I think people should feel like no matter what they are choosing, and whatever people are choosing from a palliative care point of view, we're always very supportive of them to look after them, that no one should choose voluntary assisted dying because they don't feel they can not get adequate palliative care. That's my view.
Thank you. Your Grace.
Some of the proponents of euthanasia or voluntary assisted dying claim that for them it's not one or the other. It's not palliative care or VAD. It's both. And I think the Premier has now placed herself in that category as well. Listening to the arguments over time, the question that I've come to ask myself and discuss with others is whether or not palliative care, properly understood in its most comprehensive sense, and any form of euthanasia, whatever you call it, are in the end compatible. I'm tending to think that they proceed from such radically different assumptions that in fact they are not compatible in the end. And an attempt to claim compatibility is in fact another of the illusions that can infest this issue. So I suspect that for the government to say that we are not choosing one or the other, we're choosing both. First of all, there is the vast financial shortfall that Philip has mentioned. But I think if you push beneath the surface, you come to such radically different assumptions of many kinds that the two are simply not compatible. The other thing, if I might say at this point, Madonna, is that to be sanctioning in law suicide, if an individual wants to commit suicide, he or she can, but to sanction that in law at a time when it's recognised, even by governments, that suicide is a national problem, strikes me as an extraordinarily poor piece of timing, at least.
Do you think politicians are equipped to make this decision?
No, I don't think they are for the most part, and I don't want that to sound patronising. But one of the dangers in this whole discussion or decision-making process is a penchant for the anecdotal. Now, the anecdotal is important, but it can only take you so far and is no substitute for really clear thinking. So I think the decision has to be made, of course, by our political leaders, but they need an awful lot of help other than the polls and the anecdotes to help them understand the nature of the decision that is before them. And that's one of my problems about the now rushed process in this state of Queensland. It doesn't necessarily allow the politicians to do the homework they have to do to make the decision that's before them.
And you're saying by the anecdotes, people supportive of VAD because of a bad family or personal experience.
That's right. And those stories are important and they do have to be listened to, but they only take you so far. And my fear is that people make a decision before they reach the point where clear thinking can take over. And listening to the voice, the anecdotes and the reasoning of the clinicians, some of whom we have here among us.
So how well informed do you think people, or I guess at the moment voters, are in terms of the issues around VAD, the things we've been discussing today?
I would suspect that by and large they are poorly informed because the information that they have available to them has come largely through the media and there have been high-profile media personalities who have been leading the charge on euthanasia. So again, without wishing to patronise anybody, and including myself, I suppose, do I feel well enough informed? Not really. I mean, I've done a lot more work in this area than many people, but I'm no expert, but I am a human being. But I think one of our tasks, certainly I sense this within the Catholic community, one of my prime tasks is to try and help people understand more clearly the deeper issues that are involved in this, and not just succumb to what are the cliches and claims of the culture more generally.
Thank you. Philip, during the pandemic, the Queensland Premier allowed the Chief Health Officer to make all the decisions. Would we be discussing these laws if medicos had been put in charge of this discussion?
Well, I think when you talked about surveys and things like that, I guess a lot of the surveys to the public, it often asks, it depends on how you ask a question as to what answer you get. And I think one of the, in reality, the views of clinicians and the views of medicos in some of these surveys is different to the views of the general public. And so you have a different viewpoint, and the viewpoint of AMA at the moment, Australian Medical Association, is that they're against voluntary assisted dying. And the viewpoint of the World Medical Organization is, Doctors Organization is a similar viewpoint. So from a clinician point of view, I don't think they have the same approach as necessarily the politicians would have. I mean, I think in some ways this idea about what is compatible and not compatible, it does come down to that. People often think, well, often in situations, and I remember when I was in Canada when I did a visit to Canada when Canada was bringing in their laws around MAID, as Jane was saying. And one of the things they really faced in palliative care was this perception, despite having 12 months to bring it in, right near the end, there was still this perception that, of course, this will just all happen in palliative care units. Whereas palliative care clearly says voluntary assisted dying is not part of palliative care. Yes. And I don't think, the vast majority of clinicians in the area don't think it's part of palliative care. And so I think that, I think that we have to be really clear of the differences between that we can't think that it'll happen in palliative care units. We can't think that they're the people who are going to be doing it from that point of view.
That's really interesting. And if I can go to Jane here, who's been a little bit quiet, we're talking about clinicians, and you previously brought up that data, which I had read. And there was this one piece of data out of Victoria that I struggle to understand, and perhaps you can explain. In Victoria, of those who have trained and registered to be involved in the delivery of voluntary assisted deaths, 50% of them are GPs, 16% are oncology specialists, 5% work in neurology, and interestingly, only 3% in palliative medicine. Why is that?
Well, I think it's actually why people choose to be in different disciplines and their orientation. It is a complex issue. Just going back to something that Judith said very much earlier about familiarity with death, it's not only the community. There are a lot of clinicians who actually come to a career in medicine and have had no experience of death. The most intense emotions a human being will have in their life are in the formation and breakdown of attachment bonds, falling in love and grieving. And most doctors, or many doctors, come to a career with familiarity, perhaps in falling in love, but no idea about grief. And the grief and pain of family members is terrifying. We know that doctors have higher death anxiety than the general public. Doctors like to fix things. And if we can't fix things, we often like to just sort of move them sideways. So I think in palliative care, you see people who can live with uncertainty. In psychiatry, you see people who can actually delve into the suffering and share that space. But there are a lot of doctors who choose a discipline where they're not forced into the grey.
Yeah. Do you feel equipped to have discussions on euthanasia with patients? Like, not whether you want to or not, would you be equipped to?
I'm probably not equipped in terms of the legislation, but I have end-of-life discussions with all of my patients with advanced disease. And I say, where do you think things are going? Where are things happening? What's the worst thing? Who would be affected if you die? I ask patients, what happens when you die? What do you think will happen? Do you have a strong sense of an afterlife? Do you not? This has nothing to do with any spiritual beliefs I might or might not have, but it's actually trying to help them make sense of things. And, you know, just Philip talking about cases before, I just suddenly recalled a case of someone whose husband was dying, and she said, I can't cope with this. I can't bear the suffering. They'd had a child who died some years before from a terminal illness, and it was just going to be her and her daughter. And she said, I would rather die. I'd rather kill myself. I can't bear being on my own. And I knew that she had some strong religious beliefs. And I said to her, where do you think your husband is? And sorry, where do you think your son is? And she said, he's in heaven. I said, so if your husband died, would he be with your son? And she said, yes. And I said, well, is that a way you could bear to let him go, that your son might need him more than you? And for her, making meaning and making sense of it in that way was really quite liberating. Now, I don't know the truth of what I was suggesting to her,
Yeah.
but it was a way, I guess we often work in metaphors, and it's what helps people navigate the suffering, what helps people make meaning.
There is no doubt that must be true. And it brings up this whole issue, which is front and centre here, which is palliative care, I guess. You're a psychiatrist working in oncology at the Royal Brisbane Women's Hospital.
That's
How
right.
many of you are there?
Me.
So how many can every patient have Jane by their side at some point?
So we actually have a consultation liaison service, and there is a psychiatrist who works in haematology, but I'm the only specialist psychiatrist working in solid organ tumours. So this is breast, colorectal, head and neck, glioblastomas. And, you know, you can look at me and see I'm of a reasonable age, and I do intend to retire at some stage, and I don't know who will take over that role. Please God, let me off for good behaviour. But seriously, I don't know who will take over that role. And so the problem with where I work is it's hard to get metrics. So I have a particular interest in dying parents and how they talk with their children.
Yes.
Because there is evidence about how you might actually promote resilience in those children. But the problem is I don't have data that says if I help that dying parent prepare their child for their death, that may reduce the chance of that child becoming depressed, alcoholic, homeless in their 20s. That data doesn't exist and probably never will. And so it's not valued. It's not like doing a hip replacement. There's a metric, there's a number, you can count it.
No, but let's forget metrics for a moment. I'm wondering, though, if people had access to good quality palliative care, the call for euthanasia or voluntary assisted dying or whatever you call it would be so much less.
Absolutely. See, the problem is people don't know what they don't know. And that's the issue. You know, people facing end of life who are facing existential grief, despair, demoralisation, don't realise that there are things that can be done to help them. Yes. And so why would they ask for them? Because they don't know those things exist.
Okay, Father Brennan, I've let you off pretty lightly here so far. You know, given what Jane has just said, if we had a full suite of services, and I guess particularly in rural and remote regional areas, do you think less people think it is an option, and therefore voluntary assistance dying will always be a preference until we do?
Well, I think that's right, but you live in a state where you all well know that north of Cairns and west of Charters Towers, there's almost no palliative care at all. And if VAD is brought in, there'll be no political imperative to deliver it in those places ever. And furthermore, if you live outside of Brisbane, Rockhampton, Townsville, Cairns or Toowoomba, the availability of palliative care is very slight indeed. And the imperative for providing it outside of those major cities would be very slight indeed. But having said that, yes, it will suit the politicians at the moment to say that we're more committed than ever to palliative care. But that will simply be a foil for wanting to implement their legislation for VAD. Yes, in the perfect world, if you had the full suite of palliative care, then VAD, I think, becomes a more coherent policy response, regardless of what your religious views or whatever might be. But in the absence of comprehensive palliative care, it's just not good enough.
So, Your Grace, there's probably no easy way to ask this, but if people are choosing euthanasia because of the absence of good, strong, safe palliative care, isn't that a bit of an indictment on church-run organisations as well as our governments in the delivery?
Well, to some extent, Madonna, yes, it is. And I think I can say, without making, any sort of grand commitment, that we will commit to the extension of palliative care services within the very best of our capabilities. We all know it's a vastly expensive field, but certainly the Catholic hospitals can't just say no to VAD. That's been said and will be said again, but that has to be accompanied by a commitment to extended palliative care services. Now, keeping in mind that palliative care in our understanding isn't just about pain control, that's a key element, but it goes far beyond that to beyond the physical to the psychological, the emotional, and the spiritual. And it's not just palliative care of the individual patient either, it's palliative care at least of their family, I think, as some have suggested in the discussion. So I think, first of all, there is a need to have that comprehensive understanding of what we mean by palliative care. And it is a community of love in the end, and great skill in the case of the clinicians, but a community accompanying this person in a way that, to use Jane's excellent phrase, that makes meaning. Because the choice of death surely is a recognition or a surrender, as it were, to a kind of meaninglessness. But in fact, it is possible, and I think we've all seen it, to make the deepest and richest meaning out of these horrendous experiences of pain and grief and loss and all of that, and to turn it all into something that can be acknowledged as gift and blessing. That's what making meaning is all about. So the church has to commit in an even more energetic and thorough way to making meaning, and to do it out there in the boondocks to the best of our ability. But we'll need the help of government. And this is where we need to imagine and enact new partnerships between communities like the churches, because not just us, the church and government. So we don't want a situation where it's the churches against the government. We would like to have new partnerships that really do make meaning in the state and provide the kind of palliative care that is required, and that certainly isn't here now, as Frank Brennan has said. So I can say that is our desideratum. What it will mean in practice is something we are going to have to work out, and I have met already once with the great healthcare providers, and those discussions will continue along those lines.
Okay, so we've been talking about these deep ideology things and religious things and personal freedoms and all of that. And I know I'm only a simple girl, but if it was flipped and the message more was about the provision of palliative care as opposed to permission, in your words, Your Grace, to kill yourself, wouldn't that be the thing that can turn that public support? And in that case, aren't those organisations fighting against euthanasia going along the wrong track, trying to get people to understand things as Judith and Jane and Philip says they can't understand? And palliative care is the whole thing that where your focus should be?
Well, yes, in many ways it is, of course. And the danger is that the churches can be just put in the corner with all the other naysayers, that here are we, the poor old Catholic Church, with its moral authority so battered, yet again banging on about life issues and saying no, and therefore resisting progress. Now, we have to live with that and negotiate it as best we can. And we have to try and help our own community in the first place, but where possible, the community at large, which is our concern as well. We're not just a tribe or a glee club, to understand that there's more to it than a kind of brute moral pragmatism. And there's more to it than economics. And of course, some form of euthanasia would certainly be cheaper. And we all know that the costs of medical care are astronomical, but that cannot decide this issue. And again, it questions that come down basically to what is the true ground and source of human dignity? We all bang on about human dignity, and rightly so. But it's not just that someone is beautiful or wealthy or useful or happy or able, fully abled and so on. That doesn't constitute human dignity. So to try and help people come to a simple, deep sense of what it means to be human and to have that dignity, and what it means for us all to live together in a genuinely human society, where death is not denied, but is faced and, as it were, transcended.
Thank you. And Philip, can I go to you on the back of that? Because it's not only the church or the churches, it's also, as you say, the AMA, Palliative Care Association, a whole lot of other organisations who are opposed to these laws. But your Grace talked about we have to understand what we mean by palliative care. As a medico, define palliative care. What does it mean?
Well, for me, palliative care is about helping people to live as well as they can for as long as they can. That's really what palliative care is about. Obviously, the people we deal with mostly are people with advanced illnesses that are progressive, and people who have a shortened life expectancy, and often in the realms of somewhere up to a year is around about what we see in adult palliative care. And in pediatric palliative care, it's really that life expectancy is not to make it to adulthood as such. So that's how we define palliative care. Palliative care is a very difficult thing to define. What's fascinating to me is I did some research with people from different cultural groups, and this seems so obvious in retrospect, but at the time I never really thought about it. There's no actual term for palliative care in a lot of different cultures, and that should have been so obvious to me, because it's so hard to people to understand. When I say I'm from palliative care, half the people don't know what I'm talking about, let alone different cultures. So they actually don't have a term for it from that point of view. So I think getting a message out about palliative care is done on a micro level. That's individual interactions, the day-to-day we have with clinicians, patients, families, their experience, and then on a big macro level and education and seeing, as I think Judith said at the beginning, seeing dying as part of life, just like being born's a part of life. Dying is a part of life as well, and it's something that we're all going to experience at some stage.
You're nodding, Darlene, and that goes back to what you were saying about the seasons of life when we started this conversation a little while ago. What do you have a view on what should be available in terms of palliative care, or what you would like to see available?
The professional part of me wants to say it's person-centred care. So, what that person asks for or wishes for, to enable that as much as possible. And that's difficult. We know that's difficult. We'd love to do it. It can be difficult. I was thinking when Philip was talking about different cultures not having a terminology, and the thing that immediately always pops into my mind is, you're loving someone till the end. And we recognise the great specialist traditions of bringing people into this world. And those that are gifted with special gifts of enabling people at the end of life as well to pass gently. So I guess it's to be surrounded with that sense of love. And that's not esoteric. It's the practical things. It's meal preparation. It's all of that. But recognising the importance of the work. It is important work for transformation for all concerned.
Jen?
Yes, I'm not a palliative care physician, but to me, palliative care is, as Philip said and Darlene said, person-centred care. Acute care is often protocol driven. It's driven by the service centre and the agency. It's very disappointing that the information on the website for VAD in Victoria mentions palliative care, and it has an exclusive focus on physical symptoms rather than looking at family needs, psychosocial needs, emotional and spiritual needs. And so in psychiatry, we talk about containment. So Bion talked about being a container and holding on to people's sadness and grief. And that's what we do in psychiatry. But to me, palliative care does that. It's really, I've got you, and I will care for you, and I will nurture you. And it's about you. It's not about my goals, my agenda, and what the system says.
Yeah, beautifully answered. What are you thinking, Judith?
The last couple of discussions have been very much bringing to mind the whole origin of the word palliative, from the Latin pallium, a cloak. And if you can think of a cloak just encompassing a distressed or unhappy or uncomfortable person, and how palliative care aims to bring that comfort in every single way. One thing I'd really like to mention is that when we're talking about increasing palliative care availability, it's not just as palliative care services. We've got to address, go right back. Schools need to actually educate kids about death and dying, but medical schools and nursing schools in every discipline need to introduce an aspect that palliation is an important skill, important body of knowledge. And as we've alluded a number of times, doctors, by and large, are scared of people dying, and they are just so happy sometimes to pass them over to palliative care. Well, for the most basic approaches for symptom control and relief of other forms of suffering, it's really astounding the ignorance amongst even oncologists who deal on a daily basis with people with advanced malignancy, the level of their expertise with respect to using what we consider basic medications and approaches to comfort introduction and maintenance just isn't there. The focus is of what's the latest treatment? What can we do for melanoma that we didn't do 10 years ago? What's the next thing for this person with ovarian carcinoma who've had 6 or 7 different chemos? It's not on saying, how are you going? How can we help you? What are your goals in life now?
Okay. So Philip, on the back of that, I'm wondering how many people even need palliative care? Are we tying ourselves in knots over something that affects a small proportion of the population, or what kind of proportion of the population go into palliative care?
So I think the estimate is 100,000 people in Australia a year need palliative care. And who knows how many get palliative care? It's much less than that, I think, from that point of view. So it's a large proportion of the population of the dying population need palliative care.
So a parliamentary committee here in Queensland found that for about 5% of people, the suffering is severely distressing. And even with access to quality palliative care, sometimes not all suffering can be eased.
Well, that's a very true statement about suffering. Suffering is really tough. Suffering is I think that the challenge with this idea of suffering is people often equate that with people having really bad pain and not having intractable pain, not being able to relieve with pain. I think it goes back to, one of the interesting about, one of the things Judith said about people just going to school. So I was once asked about, could a school group come and visit my palliative care unit? And I wrote about this in the Catholic Leader, how they asked about coming, and I said, that sounds a great idea. But the parents decided that they didn't want the kids to come because they worried it would somehow affect the kids badly. And like, I didn't feel like a judgment on the parents. I think a lot of people a lot of patients I see fear coming into a palliative care unit because they have this vision that people are just screaming all the time. And when people actually come into the palliative care unit, they see it as a peaceful place and a space where a lot of the things that people have talked about happen. And they're just amazed that it's not like a, it's not like a dark, dingy, screaming place, which I think is a misconception that occurs about dying. Like people, people, about a third of people with cancer, for example, who die never get any pain at all. But if you ask a cancer patient, everyone expects to have pain and everyone expects to have terrible pain.
Okay, but the parliamentary committee, finding my understanding, they use the word suffering, they defined it as in pain and discomfort. So I guess what I'm asking you is it ever all right for people to die in serious pain or discomfort?
Well, obviously, one of the aims of palliative care is to try and relieve people's pain and suffering as much as possible from that point of view. And I think suffering is a whole of person thing. Pain is a whole of person thing. And this idea that everybody is going to have all their suffering fixed up, I think is really hard, because suffering, pain, discomfort, they're really concepts of a whole thing that, and again, the other interesting thing about that is this idea that it's actually someone's role to fix that. So there's this real difference. And I think the palliative care approach is this idea of healing versus fixing. So medicine has an idea, as Jane talked about, that the doctor fixes. And I think some of the concern people have is if the doctor or the clinicians can't fix what's happening, I have to fix it up. I have to somehow go and do something else. But in fact, I think palliative care is much more compatible with this idea of healing, which is that you have to provide the space, you have to provide as much as the comfort, the clinical expertise, but a whole lot of things like from suffering have got to do with people's lives and what things can be done. And in the end, you can't make it perfect for every person.
Okay.
And I just wanted to say about that is this: it's really interesting to me, the perception of a terrible death. And I have seen lots and lots of deaths, and I've seen some great deaths, and I've seen some terrible deaths, some deaths where I thought I'd hate to be that person who died because it was just so terrible. And what amazes me is that even when I've perceived it as a pretty bad death, in fact, I can never actually remember in those situations the family ever saying to me that was terrible. And in situations where I thought the person was just absolutely perfectly peaceful and perfect death, and I thought, oh, I'd love that, I've had families come and say to me, that was horrific. I wouldn't let my dog like to die like that. And it struck me early on in my career when I had a patient had a particular form of cancer, and their father had this particular form of cancer. And they said to me, I don't want to die like my dad. It was a horrific death. And fascinating to me was the person's sister, who was there at the death with the son, said to me, I was at my dad's death and it was actually very peaceful. So I think we all have these expectations about what death is. And I think we all have different viewpoints about it. And lots of things happen in the dying process, as people have alluded to, where people aren't used to what's happening, and they think that a lot of things that are happening are suffering and terrible. And in fact, I guess as Judith was saying, a lot of our job in palliative care is to normalize what's happening, to explain to people that people have different breathing patterns. It doesn't mean they're suffering. It doesn't mean that they're distressed. It's actually a natural breathing pattern of the patient as they're dying. And a lot of my work is just to normalize the fact that I don't think the person's suffering as it's happening.
Okay, so thank you. And I can see the medicos all nodding with that. Samantha, I haven't come to you on this. You were furiously writing a moment ago. What have you written down? What do you want to say?
Oh, well, there's a robust discussion going on about assisted dying with my community as we speak. So I'm multitasking, as we women can, because we do have these really diverse opinions. And so Zoe, a young autistic woman, said she'd always been against euthanasia, and then she actually saw somebody who was dying in horrible pain because they weren't given the right kind of pain medication, the right kind of pain relief. So this is really heavily reinforced by people. So I think you know, this does all come back also to, you know, attitudinal issues. Obviously, before we get to palliative care, there's all of the other issues that, you know, make people look at accessing voluntary assisted dying. But then there's also, you know, cold hard dollars and, you know, investing in education in terms of making sure that we have enough staff and enough trained staff. It's horrifying to hear, you know, that we don't have enough psychiatric care, we don't have enough mental health support. A really, really tricky issue in terms of this. But everything that all the medicos have said has been very much reinforced by everybody else's experiences.
I've certainly seen you nodding. Can I go to you, Father Frank Brennan? That research from the PM Glynn Institute at the ACU shows the rate of public palliative care hospitalisation is rising by about 5% each year. But there's been no increase in the number of trained medical specialists or nurses to meet the demand. Even paediatric palliative care is not adequately staffed by specialists. Listening to Your Grace talking about, yes, the churches have a role here, as does other organisations, but this will be won or lost inside Parliament House. How in your view and your experience is the best way for those opposed to voluntary assisted dying laws to win that argument?
Well, I think it's to concede that we're all able to have a comprehensive worldview as to what is the desirable legislation or policy on particular issues. And yes, we have lived in a society where up until now there's been a convergence with the religious traditions with what was the majority approach on these sorts of questions. That convergence no longer exists. So I think at the very outset, there's got to be an acknowledgement that those of us with a religious view of things, we don't hold the trump cards, and that yes, we have to respect our political leaders as ones who make these sorts of decisions. But when it comes to making these sorts of decisions, that it's necessary for them to articulate what are the public policy objectives which are to be achieved, and to listen to the experts on that in achieving it. So, for example, when you have the AMA in Queensland saying, well, we're not supporting this, when you have a Royal Commission that's still out on looking at disabilities and the treatment of people with disabilities, when you've got a Royal Commission that's still out on aged care, but you have political parties saying during an election campaign, we're going to jump the gun, then you know you're dealing with a political context where there is not a firm commitment to good public policy making. Then when the debate actually comes on, it's about saying, well, all right, we may have lost on whether or not we can hold the line that doctors should do no harm. But now we move into a new domain where it's conceded that doctors will do harm in the technical sense, where that is sought by particular patients. In the first instance, it'll be the patient that says, look, doctor, the only solution to my problem is for you to assist with me ending my life. That will then become, doctor, the preferred solution for me in dealing with my problem is for you to help me with ending my life. Now, it's at that point that there is a need for concerted discussion about what are the limits on this new law which has been created. Someone spoke before about the slippery slope. I mean, the great Pellegrino, the American ethicist, once made the point, make no mistake, there is a slippery slope. Because once you move the major moral parameter from do no harm, well, with do no harm, there's been a whole development of the philosophy and the practice of medicine over generations, which has allowed people to develop the professional expertise. Once you change it then to no, it's not any longer do no harm, it's when requested in particular circumstances, you will assist this patient to end their life.
Yes.
Now, there, I think, to my mind, there are 4 particular major policy problems which require respectful discussion on, all right, we've lost the debate about do no harm, but given that we've lost that debate, where now do we find the balance between respecting the independence of the invulnerable patient who says, I know what I'm about and just help me do it, over against the protection of the vulnerable. Second is then, how do you then draw the line where, as the Archbishop has said, you know, we in Australia, we face a huge issue, particularly with youth suicide. All right, all very well to say, yes, the person who's dying of cancer, who'll die in 2 months' time, can avail themselves of this service of the doctor. But why can't the young rugby player who's now a quadriplegic, who's chronically depressed, say, well, look, if you respect me as being a self-determining individual who says, I've lost my dignity, just like that person, because I've lost my control and I've lost my sense of independence, where then becomes that sort of dividing line? And then the huge one, which confronts all of us who have ever gone into a nursing home, we know with the increasing number of patients suffering dementia, where down the track, we say, oh, well, it's those who make a self-determining decision that they would like their life now ended. Now, the person who's going into dementia, all right, gives an advance directive. Please do me in. We've all encountered enough people with dementia, no matter what they said 2 or 3 months ago, there are some, because they're actually human beings, that spark which is there, no matter what I said before, if they could actually speak their minds, but they can't because they're adult, if I could actually speak my mind, the little bit of life that's left with me, I'd actually now like to hang on to it. So those who are actually the most vulnerable will be those who will be the ones who, in an involuntary sense, will suffer. Now, these are not scaremongerings. These are attempts to engage in the respectful policy discussion about setting the limits on these things once we've crossed the Rubicon. It's acknowledging the Rubicon has been crossed in places like Victoria and in Western Australia, and the Rubicon is readily crossed when you get a combination of health bureaucrats, left of centre populist government, and a medical profession which has not been trained for the provision of comprehensive palliative care services.
I want to go to you, Grace, on something there, but just a very quick answer to this, Father Brandon. Going on that, has there been any concerns raised in Victoria about the level and services to palliative care once the euthanasia laws were operating for a while? Are people now talking about reducing the palliative care need?
I think it's still early days, but I think, I mean, one of the good things here in Victoria is there have been some church groups, I mean, particularly you see it with St. Vincent's, with the expanded facility they're building, with what the Mercies have done, with what the Knights of Malta have done, with one of the Eastern palliative care services. I mean, they've made, you know, truly fabulous expansion of their services.
So, Your Grace, have we crossed the Rubicon?
Well, I think we have in Australia and in other parts of the Western world. This, of course, is not an issue in the rest of the world by and large at all. It's a peculiarly Western thing in its roots and in its manifestation. But I think we do cross the Rubicon in a number of ways. Frank has outlined them clearly, I think. But also in the discussion, it's been clear that for the medical profession to be part of this process means that the medical profession itself crosses a mighty threshold.
Yeah.
And the consequences of these decisions can be fateful and unforeseen. They were for Caesar when he crossed the Rubicon, and for anyone who crosses a metaphoric Rubicon, they are also heading into unknown territory, much of which may not be as glorious as Julius Caesar's turned out to be. So look, we have crossed the Rubicon. There are certain shifts, some of them seismic in the culture, that people like me have to accept. And I have no wish to indulge in the kind of cultural warfare which would see the Catholic Church or the churches generally engage in battle with the government, whichever government may prevail in this state or elsewhere. I am genuinely interested in the kind of respectful, dialogue of which Frank has spoken. We are committed, I think. We have the competence in the Catholic community. Our experience of healthcare is vast. Our resources are vast. And we would like to sit down around the table, having crossed the Rubicon. We hope there's still a table at which to sit, and we're not simply discarded or disdained as political adversaries.
Okay.
To sit down and have these kinds of discussions about policy and its implementation that would be in the interests of the entire community of Queensland, at least.
Darlene, I can't help thinking that First Nations people are almost a secret weapon in those discussions, because our politicians are listening to their needs. Do you think the polling that we've been quick to dismiss, but the polling showing support for voluntary assisted dying would be reflected amongst First Nations people, or do you think they would see it very, very differently?
I think that they would see it very differently, and the word abhorrent comes to mind. And that's a very general comment. I have no research at hand to back that up, only lived experience and community connections.
Okay, and yeah, sorry, did you want to say something else, Darlene, there?
I would say that many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people nationally, this is frightening. These conversations are frightening, but may feel unempowered, disempowered, not able to challenge at the levels that this needs to be challenged.
Yes, I just wonder if politicians were fronted. Yes, Father Frank Brennan?
When the legislation was first brought in the Northern Territory, it was one of the things which was most arresting in the debate then, because First Nations people from remote communities said we would be terrified to go to hospital. Why would we get on a plane to go into Darwin knowing that doctors can kill you? And they said, if this happens, there'll be payback, because if the doctors kill my relative, there will be payback. Yeah. Now, what we did see in the Northern Territory was that, of course, there were no palliative care services whatever in those remote communities in those days, probably still isn't. And that the idea that doctors would do these things was unacceptable. Now, if you fast forward, look at the splendid intervention made by Patrick Dodson, one of the most respected Indigenous leaders in the country, speaking for the First Nations perspective on this issue recently, when it was then being raised in Western Australia. And sadly, with the sort of debate we have in this country, the proponents, or some of the proponents for the change, said, oh, that's because he used to be a Catholic priest. Anyone who knows Patrick Dodson knows that he is first and foremost a fearless leader of First Nations peoples. And that is what he was addressing. But we know that in politics, anything is judged to be something that's acceptable.
Yeah. And Samantha, I could see you wanted to add something on the Indigenous perspective there.
Oh, hugely. So we have huge issues around the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and Aboriginal people being able to access it. You know, the engagement rates and the support rates are low. We have, if you look up the coroner's report of a young woman named Shona Hookey, it's Hookey. She was a 30-ish-year-old Aboriginal woman who had an intellectual disability, lived in a group home. The story is horrendous, that she went to a hospital and was basically switched off because of the devaluing that we have of Aboriginal people. So as somebody who has Aboriginal family members who lives on Balladong country in Western Australia, this is a huge issue. And if you look at the level of engagement that they did in New Zealand with the Indigenous community there, you look at the level of engagement that we've had with community leaders in Australia around the VAD debate. I think it's enormously concerning that we just haven't had, if you're looking at the people who are at the most risk of accidentally dying, of being coerced into dying, of being switched off, in ways that they shouldn't be, then, these are the people that we need to ask first.
Okay, so what should be done from here? What's the next step in this process? Your Grace?
So, oh, sorry. So I have a different perspective, I guess, that I'm not inherently against voluntary assisted dying, which is a complicated position to speak about because I come from a secular viewpoint. But until we meet the preconditions of people not living in disadvantage, of things like palliative care being funded properly, of our healthcare system and gaps and inequities being addressed, of internalized ableism, and all the mental health systems all being addressed, we can't actually safely do this. And lawmakers are supposed to make laws to keep people safe. So I guess that's for me our next step.
Your Grace?
Well, look, first of all, I think that religious people like me can't be confined to a kind of corral. We're over there talking all this funny God talk or religious speak. There are, in fact, I think, potent secular, to use that word, the word that Sam has used, secular arguments against a push for euthanasia through the law. And I think it is important for people like me and others, perhaps people like Sam and me, to identify common ground, and that's challenging. So that's one form of dialogue that has to happen for the good of the community, the common good. The other is that there needs to be the same kind of creative and vigorous dialogue between religious communities like my own and the great healthcare institutions that we sponsor and the government. And that task is not only to negotiate the details of implementation, but it also has perhaps a mutually instructive educational process. So that needs to happen too. In other words, the reach beyond slogans and superficialities that really do beset discussion of this issue, and also just as I say, to free it from the corral of religion, to free the discussion from the corral of politics. Now, of course, it has political ramifications, as it does religious ramifications and so on. But my fear, certainly at the moment in Queensland, is it is being corralled into the political arena. And that is a seriously reductive approach to an issue that we all know is multidimensional and complex. So if I think of any one word of what has to happen now for the good of the whole community, it's dialogue moving at those different levels and those different directions. The worst that could happen would be the politically minimalist thing of just building walls and looking the other way and to say to hell with you.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but I'd love to go to each of you and just give you 30 seconds to answer the question that I should have asked you, but that I didn't. I mean, what is the point that you want to make or for people to remember beyond next week or the week after? And if I can start with you, Jane, and just go through each one. Jane.
Yeah, I think that the debate is so polarised, and that's what troubles me. Either you're for euthanasia and for liberation and relief of suffering, or you're a Luddite. And people who express reservations are pilloried as being unsophisticated. We need a more nuanced discussion. And, sorry, I'm taking more than 30 seconds. I just wanted to actually give you an example that resonates with what Philip said. We can't assume to know people's experience of death. And I remember a woman I thought was having a terrible death. And when I spoke to her husband, he said to me, she gave us a gift. She showed how hard she wanted to struggle to be with us. So we should never assume.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that someone raised earlier too, how we equip those around a patient to support or otherwise that person. Judith, 30 seconds. What haven't I asked you I should have?
I'd like for people to be educated, both the public and our healthcare professionals, so that people realise so much of assisted suicide changes what doctors and health professionals do. It changes the very core of their approach. and that there is so much that can be done that we already have the means to do, that we need to care.
Thank you, Judith. Darlene. Can I just get you to turn your audio on, Darlene?
Audio helps always. Perhaps a little bit off track, but through the whole conversation, I was actually thinking there is some irony in the fact that we have Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, cultures decimated, but perhaps some of the most beautiful lived experiences of caring palliatively for loved ones, behind the scenes, with simple resources, and that connection with society and broader community. And that inspires me.
So just, sorry, and I'm having 30 seconds here. How can we then use that, or people in this discussion use that so our politicians can see and understand that?
It's almost like a broader society has crumbled, and some of the love and the respect that governs these actions just isn't there or is easily accessible. I guess when you live with a common thought, a common understanding that this person can give and teaches us still until that moment of natural passing, and even then we are stronger and we don't forget them, it can be beautiful.
Thank you. Father Frank Brennan.
I would say, having crossed the Rubicon, how do we shape the contours for the dying and loved ones to make the right decision, ensuring that adverse motives and lack of agency cannot result in untimely and involuntary death?
Thank you. And Samantha, you've been such a wonderful addition to our panel today. What would you like to leave us with?
I'm going to set my stopwatch because there's too much. So as also
you can have some of the Archbishop's time. Go for 40.
So as a member of the autistic community, you know, we have 1 in 5 women who are autistic and have ADHD make a suicide attempt in their lifetime, you know, and have suicidal ideation. We have huge issues around devaluing. We have huge issues about not being given the support that we need to live. So how can we be given an actual choice about being able to die? They're my primary concerns. And I think we just need to listen to the smallest voices and the people who have the most stake in this. You know, there shouldn't be coercion, and we should each be valued equally as people whose lives are worth living.
When you said listen to the people with the smallest voices, everyone nodded. Your Grace, final word?
Well, life, as we know, can be hard and seem meaningless, but and death can be too. But human life and death can also be experienced as a great gift and full of surprising and beautiful meaning. And the truly human task, and this applies to governments, is to enable people to pass from that which is hard and meaningless to that which is gift and blessing.
And that draws to a close our discussion on the Care First approach to end-of-life care. And a big thank you to Archbishop Mark Coleridge, Chair of St Vincent's Health Reconciliation Action Plan, Darlene Dries, Dr Philip Good from St Vincent's Private Hospital, Dr Judith McInerney, a retired palliative medicine specialist, disability rights advocate Samantha Connor. Thank you, Samantha. Father Frank Brennan, Rector at Newman College at the University of Melbourne, and Professor Jane Turner. Thank you.